First Energy's fifth electric security plan, case number 23301 EL SSO. We'll dispense with appearances, but with me are Jackie St. John and Megan Addison. We, the attorney examiners, will be presiding over this hearing. I don't have much for the parties other than to turn the ball over to First Energy, but I'll open the floor for any questions in case anybody has any. We are being broadcast on YouTube, I believe YouTube. So if you have clients or technical people who need to watch, they can watch on YouTube. And I think we circulated the information. Any questions, comments? Okay, thank you all. Mr. Knight, Mr. Alexander, you have the floor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, everybody. I'm Brian Knipe, one of the attorneys representing Ohio Edison Company, Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company, and the Toledo Edison Company. And I want to thank you for your interest in the company's fifth electric security plan. This technical conference is for the companies to help you understand the content of their filing. With me are Sonny Finelli, our Ohio Director of Rates and Regulatory Affairs, as well as Trevor Alexander, one of our outside counsel. Some of you have some familiarity with the proposal because you participated in some open meetings that the companies held in November and February, where the companies in that process solicited input from interested stakeholders, listened and incorporated that feedback into the planning of this case. And then by the time of the second meeting in February, the companies continued to solicit feedback and listen, but also were in a position to start to share our thoughts on what would be in this filing. So for those of you who participated in that process, you were able to get a preview of much of the application. But for those who were not part of the process, we're going to start with Sonny giving a walkthrough of the application, and then at that point we can open this up for questions about the filing, for any clarification that's needed. We also have some of our subject matter experts in attendance as well. So a couple of additional notes. This is, of course, these technical conferences are intended to be constructive discussions of what the company filed. We're not in a position to discuss settlement or reach agreement on any terms, so we won't be able to do anything along those lines. Also, we won't be engaging in any sort of discussion or debate over law or policy issues or talking about other matters that are pending before the Commission. So there may be instances also where a question just doesn't lend itself to resolution in this forum because it's so technical in nature or requires consideration of so much data. In that case, certainly we have the discovery process, and we'll be happy to respond with whatever information is requested. So regarding the subject of the case. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sonny.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I echo Brian's opening remarks. Thanks for joining us, for your time and your attention and interest in this case. This is our fifth electric security plan. Our current electric security plan 4 that's in effect now is an 8-year plan that runs through May of next year, through May 31st, 2024. So what we're proposing here for our fifth electric security plan is another 8-year term starting June 1st of 2024 and running through May 31st of 2032. One of the core components of the application is the CBP process, the process we propose to employ to procure power for our customers that don't shop. Historically, we have conducted a series of auctions, varying product lengths, staggered and laddered those products and blended the results to get the retail SSO rate, generally taking the same approach here in ESP5 in our proposal, where we'll conduct a series of auctions. We have, though, included in this particular application a few propose what we view as enhancements to the process that are intended, from our perspective, to try to increase supplier participation and mitigate risk and ultimately help mitigate price increases for customers. So I'll step through each of those very briefly. The first one of those enhancements we referred to as the volumetric risk cap. This is a provision that would cap or put a ceiling on the amount of SSO load that winning bidders are obligated to serve. So providing some assurance to the suppliers going into the auction of the maximum amount that they would need to serve. The second proposed enhancement really has to do with the products themselves. Again, historically, we have had 1, 2, and 3-year products, conducted multiple auctions each year, and kind of layered and averaged those results together. Generally, again, taking the same approach, though our proposal in ESP5 is to not have a 3-year product. We'll just use a 1-year and a 2-year product. The thought there being the 3-year product, the longest length, may tend to carry with it higher risk premium. So we've proposed to only do 1-year and 2-year products. The third enhancement has to do with capacity. We proposed a capacity proxy price mechanism, which that provision would come into play in the event that we have an SSO auction scheduled. And at that time, the capacity auctions at PJM have not yet been finalized. So the applicable capacity price for the upcoming delivery year is not yet known. This proxy price mechanism would allow our companies to move forward with the SSO auction as scheduled, using a proxy price that suppliers can use to bid in that auction. And then once the actual capacity prices are known, there would be a true-up and reconciliation process for the suppliers. So it's intended as a way to hopefully mitigate or avoid disruption in our SSO auction schedule to the extent there's delays or other factors that impact the PJM capacity auctions. We've also proposed a few modifications to the credit requirements in our master supply agreement, as well as a modification to the allocation of unaccounted for energy among the market participants. And all of these things, again, from the company's view, are intended to try to mitigate risk in the process and ultimately help mitigate price increases for our customers. With respect to the cost recovery for the standard service offer, really no proposed changes. We're proposing to use the same riders and mechanisms that we have in place today under our ESP4, use those same recovery mechanisms working the same way under ESP5. Moving from generation to transmission next, our proposal within the ESP5 related to transmission is to continue the rider that we have in place today, which I'll try to explain here momentarily, but to introduce a new rate design change that applies to commercial and industrial customers with qualifying metering. And the intent behind that approach is to better align the retail recovery for these non-market-based transmission costs with the way that PJM assigns costs at the wholesale level, which is based on contribution to the transmission system peak. We also feel this proposed rate design change may provide those customers more tools or the opportunity to better manage their retail transmission costs by managing their NSPL value or their contribution to the transmission system peak. Right now we have a rider. The acronym for us is NMB. That's the transmission rider we have that passes through the costs that our operating companies incur from PJM. We also have a pilot program in place today that's available to certain eligible commercial and industrial customers, where essentially those customers can shop for those transmission services. There's also recently an option within that program where customers can continue to take generation service from the utility and through a manual billing process be billed for transmission in a way that's different than the standard default rider NMB rate. So that's the way we're set up today. With our ESP5 proposal, looking to continue rider NMB, when we'd introduce what we call in the tariff an NMB2 rate, which would apply just to the commercial and industrial customers that have interval or advanced metering. And for those customers, the retail charge under the rider NMB tariff would be based on a per NSPL charge versus a per billing demand charge, which is the way it is today. For everybody else, for all the other customers, residential, the traffic lighting customers, or customers that don't have that metering, really no changes proposed. We'll still calculate the revenue requirement the same way. We'll still allocate it the same way that we do today, which is based on contribution to the 4 coincident system peaks. The only change is for those customers that have the advanced or interval metering. And the reason for that is that with that metering capability, they're in a better position to manage their hourly loads and ultimately manage their NSPL that could be used for billing purposes. From a timing perspective, did you want to take questions now or wait? Okay. From a timing perspective, we are proposing that these changes go into effect April 1st of 2025. A couple reasons for that. First, that aligns with our normal annual update process. Right now, rider NMB changes on or about April 1st each year, so it would allow us to maintain that annual update process, and also provide a bit of a transition period for the impacted customers, whereby if they're going to be billed up based on their NSPL starting April of 2025, they'll have the year 2024 to manage their peaks that would be used to set their NSPLs that will be used for billing purposes in 2025. Moving on to distribution. There's a couple of mechanisms that we have in place today under our current ESP that allow our companies the opportunity to recover costs associated with incremental capital investment. We are proposing in our ESP largely to continue those, and I'll talk about that more here shortly. And in addition to that, we do have 2 new distribution-related rider proposals that are in our ESP5 application. And these proposals are really intended to support important maintenance activities that our companies undertake on their distribution system for storm restoration and for vegetation management. So I'll try to step through each of those here briefly one by one. As far as what we have today, we have 2 different riders that allow the opportunity for recovery of incremental capital costs. One of those is specific to approved grid modernization projects. For us, that's AMI is the rider AMI. And then separate from that, we have rider DCR, which is a mechanism for recovery of capital costs that are non-grid mod related. So for rider DCR, what we're proposing in the ESP5 is largely to continue it under the same terms and conditions that are in place today. Calculate it the same way, quarterly reconciliation, as well as the annual audit process. There are a couple of changes, though, that we've proposed. One is to the revenue caps. This rider is capped today under our current ESP. We're proposing it continue to be capped under ESP5, but we're proposing that those annual caps increase each year to reflect ongoing investment in the distribution system. The caps themselves we're approaching a little differently than we have in prior ESPs. What we've proposed in this case is annual aggregate revenue cap increases for rider DCR of between $15 and $21 million per year. And the reason there's a range is because we're trying to share in the performance risk that the companies have. And by that I mean the level of cap increase under our proposal would be dependent upon the company's reliability performance. So the better the reliability performance, the higher the cap increase up to the 21 million, and vice versa down to 15 million per year. So in our testimony, you'll see more details that describe how that range and that band would work. But that's the general concept for the DCR cap proposal. The other change to DCR is really more of a timing one. Separate from this electric security plan, we are going to be filing a base distribution rate case about a year from now in May of 2024. So when that base distribution rate case is resolved, naturally rider DCR is going to reset to 0 because those capital investments we would expect to be moved into base rates through the rate base that's in base rates, and then DCR would reset to 0, and as we propose it would have the opportunity to recover any incremental capital beyond the date certain in the rate case subject to the revenue caps. For the other capital recovery rider, the grid mod one, rider AMI, really all we're proposing here in the ESP is to continue that rider. The specific grid modernization projects and terms and conditions around cost recovery associated with those projects, things like operational savings, cost caps, those types of provisions would still be under our proposal, subject to separate proceedings before the commission, like they have been in the past. So all we're seeking within the ESP framework under this proposal is to continue the rider. So that's continuation of the current distribution-related mechanisms. As far as the two new ones I mentioned earlier, we're trying to focus on provisions that support investment in and maintenance of the distribution system, and have proposed two new rider mechanisms that help facilitate and support our maintenance of the system. The first is related to storm restoration work. Right now, we have the authority to defer incremental storm expense compared to the baseline levels that are in our base distribution rates. That's a deferral that's been in place for years, was authorized back in our last distribution rate case, and has been continued in our ESP cases. So what we're proposing here in the ESP5 proposal is to establish a new rider, a storm rider, that would serve two purposes. The first purpose of the storm rider would be to use that to recover from or return to customers the cumulative storm deferral balance that the companies have as of May 31st, 2024. And our proposal for that piece of the rider is to do that over 5 years with carrying costs on the deferred balance like is calculated today. And then the other piece, the other aspect of the storm recovery rider that we're proposing would be to use it going forward, starting June 1st of 2024, to reconcile or true up our actual storm expenses to our actual revenues, so that customers on a going forward basis are only subject to paying for the actual storm costs that we incur. And the rider would be subject to annual audit, reconciliation, and update. Because it's tied to the baseline in our base distribution rates, when our base distribution rate case is resolved, to the extent we have a new baseline level in our new base rates, we would update the storm calculation to reflect that new baseline. The intent just being to make sure that between base rates and the rider, we are only seeking to recover from customers our actual storm costs incurred. We don't have an estimate of what the deferred balance will be as of May 31st, 2024. What we included in our application, as you'll see in our testimony and supporting schedules, is we used the balance that we had at the time, which in the aggregate for the three companies was approximately $126 million of deferred storm cost. So that's going to change. That's likely going to change between now and May of 2024, but that's what you'll see in the filing. The final point on the storm rider is we did include a cap provision, trying to provide some assurance or rate mitigation to customers for the portion of the storm rider where we would seek to reconcile going forward storm costs that are incremental to our base distribution rates. We've proposed a cap on that so that on an annual basis, customers know they won't have to pay more than those cap amounts for that portion of our cost. So you'll see that that proposal explained in a little more detail in our application and supporting testimony. For vegetation management, similar proposal. That's our other new one that we're seeking here. And the proposal there is to establish a rider that essentially would work pretty similar to what I just talked about on the storm, where we have a baseline amount that's in our base distribution rates, and then we would use that vegetation management rider to recover from or return to our customers incremental amounts compared to that baseline. As part of this proposal, the vegetation management area, we have identified what we believe is a good opportunity to provide some benefits to our customers by doing some enhanced or accelerated vegetation management work. And the rider proposal, we think, will help support our ability to be able to do that work. The baseline, as I said earlier, just like storm, will need to reset in the vegetation management rider calculation once we have new base distribution rates. So mechanically, that would kind of work similar to the storm. In terms of the cost estimates, we do have more details in our filing. For the enhanced portion of the program that we're proposing, it's an 8-year program. For years 1 through 4, the estimated average annual expense is about $48 million across the 3 companies. And then for years 5 through 8, it drops down closer to $27 million a year on average. So that's just for the enhanced portion of the work. When you add that to the base level work that we're doing anyway for vegetation management, over this 8-year term on average, the vegetation management O&M expense that we estimated is around $95 million per year on average over the 8 years. We've also proposed a cap provision for the vegetation management rider, again, in trying to provide some protection for customers in terms of ceilings on the amounts that they would have to pay under these mechanisms. This one would work a little differently. We looked at this one more in aggregate across the whole 8-year term of the program and have proposed to limit the amount of vegetation management O&M expense that customers are paying over this 8-year term to the amounts that we've estimated in our filing. So it's more of a total aggregate cap across all customers for the duration of the plan. I want to move next to talk a little bit about energy efficiency and demand response. We have included in our application a proposal to do some utility offered energy efficiency and demand response programs. It's a 4-year portfolio of programs. The average annual expense that we estimated is about $72 million per year. There's a lot more details in our filing and in our testimony about what the programs are. Generally at a high level for residential customers, it's things like rebates, education on how they can use energy more efficiently. There's a demand response portion of the proposal, as well as a low-income energy efficiency program. Our Community Connections program, which is what we have today, we're proposing to continue that and increase it as part of the proposal here in ESP5, excuse me. There's also some programs designed or targeted towards small commercial customers as well. The large commercial and industrial customers would have the ability to opt out of participating in these programs, thereby opting out of paying for the costs under the associated recovery mechanism. In our testimony, we did include cost-benefit analyses that estimate or conclude from our perspective that these programs are going to be cost beneficial. So there's more detail in our testimony on that. With respect to the cost recovery, we're trying to approach that differently this time than we have in prior cases. Historically, when we had energy efficiency, we would try to recover the costs in the year they're incurred. And we also had the opportunity to recover lost revenue and the opportunity to earn incentives, shared saving incentives. This time around for ESP5, we are really just trying to focus on making the programs available to customers so they have the opportunity to save on their electric bill and for us to just recover our costs. So we are not including or proposing any lost revenue recovery, nor are we proposing any sort of incentive mechanism like shared savings. Further, to try to mitigate the impacts on customers' bills, we're proposing to spread out the cost recovery over a longer period of time, over 8 years. So for example, if we spend money in year 1 on these programs, our proposal is that we would recover those costs over 8 years with a carrying cost on it so that customers aren't bearing the full impact of that up front. Separate from that portfolio of programs that we're proposing, we currently have a tariff-based interruptible or curtailable program that's available to qualifying larger commercial and industrial customers. It's, for us, that acronym is ELR, Rider ELR. Under our ESP4, Rider ELR is scheduled to expire May 31st of next year. For our proposal here in ESP5, we are seeking to continue rider ELR with a couple of modifications to it. The first one has to do with the credits that the ELR customers receive. We're proposing to start to gradually step down those credits that those customers receive, and other customers that pay for those credits would thereby get a bill reduction going forward. The other change that we're seeking as part of our rider ELR proposal is more of an administrative one. Today, our Ohio companies handle a lot of the administration for the ELR demand response resources. We're coordinating with PJM. We're helping to handle the testing of the demand response resources, really acting as the curtailment service provider. Under our proposal here for ESP5, we're looking for our companies not to do that anymore, and instead the rider ELR customers would be going to participate in PJM capacity markets themselves as a demand response resource and using their own curtailment service provider. So those are the two changes. You know, with the ELR proposal, we recognize it's a balance of interest here. We're trying to balance and manage a number of different things. We're looking at rate impacts, both to the participating customers and the non-participating customers, trying to provide a reasonable balance there, while also trying to continue encouraging these demand response resources to be available at PJM, and also recognizing the value that these demand response resources have from an economic development perspective in our service territory, as well as from a local distribution standpoint, as we would retain under our proposal the ability to call on these ELR resources in the event that there's a local emergency on the distribution system. I want to move next to talk just a little bit about our tariffs and our riders. There's a schedule or an attachment to my testimony in our filing that provides a list of all of our current riders and relevant tariff provisions. And what we've tried to do there is identify which ones we're seeking to change, which ones are continuing with no change, which ones are new, and also which ones we're proposing to eliminate. As we looked at the tariffs as we were developing this case, we identified what we thought was an opportunity to do some cleanup and try to streamline the tariffs a little bit, and that there are several provisions in our tariff book today that are inactive or not currently being used for various reasons. And so we're proposing here as part of the ESP5 to eliminate those, and the list of those again is provided in the I think it's attachment 1 to my testimony. Those would go away June 1st of 2024, and hopefully the intent there is to make the tariff book smaller, make it a little easier for customers and others to navigate through it, as well as to provide certainty to customers that some of these older provisions aren't going to be there in the future. Now, some of these provisions that we're proposing to do away with do have some residual balances, some legacy residual balances associated with them. So as part of the cleanup, the other aspect of our proposal is that we would do a final reconciliation, aggregate those residual balances together, which across the companies and by individual rider, it changes, of course, but in aggregate for all of these things, for all three companies, it is a net liability, the money that we owe back to customers. So our proposal is that we would aggregate those balances together and use them as an offset to the initial charges under the vegetation management rider that would go into effect. So we'd clean up the residual balances and have those tariffs be eliminated effective June 1st. With respect to bill impacts generally, we do have a detailed typical bill analysis in our filing that shows estimated bill impacts by rate schedule and by various usage levels. Just to hit that at a high level, when we look on average across all of our customers, which the vast majority are residential, of course, but on average across everybody, we estimated a year one or initial bill impact of about 2.3% increase on the total bill on average for year one. And then when you look on average across the 8 years, the year-over-year average impact is at about 0.6% per year. That's for all the customers. We view those as reasonable. The initial year one impacts are on the higher end compared to the average on the back end because of some of these newer things going into effect in year one. And then once you get past year one, the impacts kind of stabilize from there. So again, there's more details on those schedules that are in our filing. The last thing we wanted to mention here as part of the overview is an area that we've referred to in our application as stewardship. And when we put our application together, there were 3 key areas that we tried to focus on. The first was reliability. Talked a little bit already about some of the proposals that we have that are aimed at promoting or supporting reliable service for our customers. The second key factor that we looked at was affordability. We recognize and understand the impacts on customers that some of these things would have, and so we've included proposals to try to mitigate that. Whether it be cost caps, changes to the auction process, as I talked about earlier, measures that are intended to help mitigate the impacts for customers. The third area, though, of focus for us was what we referred to as stewardship, which is opportunity, as we saw it, to try to positively impact our customers and do some good for them. And so to that end, we've included a proposal in the plan where we would spend $52 million over the 8-year term of the plan without recovering any of that from customers. And those dollars would be intended to help support our customers in various initiatives. The biggest portion of that $52 million that we've identified in our application is to support low-income customers. We have some bill payment assistance programs in place today. We're proposing to continue and expand on those as part of the ESP5. So those bill assistance programs are targeted at $20 million of that 52 without cost recovery from customers. And in addition to that, we're proposing to introduce a bill discount program that's available to eligible low-income senior citizen customers. And that's targeted at $16 million over this 8-year plan. So between the bill assistance program and the senior citizen discount, that makes up 36 of the 52. The rest of it, 12 of the rest of it, or at least 12 of the rest of it, is for companies providing support to our customers to improve their experience, make them better informed about electric vehicles. We are not looking to, as part of this ESP, we're not proposing to invest in any infrastructure or own any infrastructure associated with electric vehicles. Rather, this proposal is just for things like providing education, providing incentives to customers so that they're better informed and can have a better experience as they look at transitioning or converting to electric vehicles. So that comprises at least 12 million of the 52. The last piece of the stewardship commitment is related to a grid modernization project. We are currently directed by the Commission to work with the staff to submit an application to the DOE, seeking some DOE grant money for a grid modernization project. It's an energy storage as a distribution asset project. To the extent that application gets approved and we receive some DOE grant money for it, for the remainder of the cost that's not paid for by the grant, we're committing here as part of the ESP to cover the first $4 million of that and not recover that from customers. To the extent that program doesn't get approved or doesn't happen or gets approved at a much lower level, we still want to preserve the overall $52 million, so we will take whatever remaining funds are not used on that project and repurpose it to support the electric vehicle education and incentive initiative that I mentioned a moment ago. So we're really just trying to preserve the overall value of $52 million that we've proposed in this case. That was the last topic we had in the overview. I do appreciate your patience in me walking through that. As Brian said, we do have a number of members of our team here. We're glad to try to take any questions at this time. Kevin, Mr. Murray.
Yeah, just one question. You, in describing the change to the transmission billing for industrial customers, you indicated that would be pushed to not start until April 1st of 2025. Does that mean that the customers who are currently on the transmission billing pilot program would continue into the pilot program for that time?
Yes, thank you for the clarification. Yes, we would keep everything as is until March 31st of 2025. Thank you for the clarification. I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Yes. Yes. Sorry.
Historically, for Synergy's transmission pilot, that you've vetted suppliers, whereas other utilities have done it differently. Are we going to continue, starting in 25, continue to use press providers to secure transmission?
Under this proposal, no, if I'm understanding the question correctly, the current pilot program, as you said, allows customers to shop with a CREZ for those services. We're viewing this rate design change to bill the commercial and industrial customers with interval meters as really a replacement for that pilot program. So instead of having to shop for those services with the supplier, we're trying to provide a similar outcome to those customers via retail rate design, where they would just be billed on their NSPL, and then the utility would be responsible for all of the transmission-related charges from a settlement perspective. Ms. Boyko, did you have a question?
Thank you. Following up on the rider NMB, you mentioned it's for all CNI with interval metering regardless of the rate schedule that they're on?
Yes, that's how we proposed it.
And then also, in the application, there's a mention of UFE charges included in rider NMB. Could you maybe explain a little bit more what that is and what the amount of that is?
Sure. I will try my best, and then if anyone else has anything to add. We're proposing, as part of the ESP, to change the allocation of unaccounted for energy. Right now, that unaccounted for energy is allocated across the suppliers based on an allocation process, but we're proposing to do, really with the intent of trying to mitigate risk for suppliers in the bidding process, is to not have suppliers be allocated that anymore. Instead, the utilities will assume responsibility for 100% of the unaccounted for energy. So it would be more of a non-bypassable type of a charge that we would incur from PJM, and then we would roll that into our rider NMB revenue requirement. So it's intended to try to de-risk a bit the suppliers from having to account for that UFE in their bids, and put it on the utilities to have that billed to them from PJM and included in the rider NMB rate schedule. As far as an estimate, I'm not sure I'm in a position to share that today. I'm not sure we had an estimate in our filing, unless anyone has anything to add.
So just to clarify, you take it out of the SSO and you're going to put it in NMB1?
It will go into the NMB revenue requirement, yes. So SSO suppliers wouldn't, or suppliers in general, wouldn't be responsible for it anymore. It would move to be non-bypassable and would be included as part of the NMB revenue requirement.
Ed might know the number.
Ed Stein for Synergy, just for introductions. We don't have a dollar amount, but we do publicly post the amount of megawatts by hour that UFE is on our data room for the auction process, so folks can at least get an idea of the megawatts that are in there. The only cautionary tale to that is it's going to evolve as more AMI meters are going in. So it's truly a historical only book. And just keep in mind, as AMI meters begin with Grid Mod 1 and continue with Grid Mod 2, et cetera, the number will change. So I just want to put that out there. But we do at least have historical information out there on it.
Post where?
It's, and I don't remember the exact websites on it.
We have a website set up. I think it's firstenergycbp.com. It's our auction website for our SSO auctions. There's like a data room and other links on there that provide various data files and other supporting documents. Thanks, Ed, for the help on that.
Thank you, Sonny.
Sure.
I had some questions about the rider DCI, the revenue caps, and kind of the allocation of that. So you mentioned that the revenue cap, as well as the annual proposed increases, are aggregated across all the operating companies, right?
Yes, the $15 to $20 million proposal that I mentioned, that would be an aggregate for the three companies, yes.
Okay. And so in witness McMillan's testimony, he says the individual company annual revenue caps will continue to be the following percentages of the aggregate caps, which was 50% for OE, 70% for CEI, and 30% for TE. Is that like, if I'm understanding
It wouldn't be allocated at discretion. It would be based on costs. So I think the by company caps are really just to recognize where you're spending your money and incurring your cost. The individual percentage of that aggregate cap changes by company. So there isn't discretion involved. It's more cost based. But when we look at it from a rate design perspective, so we look at it to make sure no company is over their cap. But then in the aggregate, to the extent we're over the cap, we would adjust the rates downwards so that we avoid hitting the cap or exceeding the aggregate cap.
Okay. And I believe that he also mentioned that those individual company caps were set in a previous ESP case. Is that correct?
Yes, those are the individual company caps that we have in place today under ESP4.
Do the current kind of expected expenditures for reliability projects still conform to those caps, or is that something you guys considered adjusting?
Just one point of clarification you mentioned reliability projects specifically.
Just any
You mean
stuff
in
on
general
DCR?
for rider DCR? I don't believe we included in our filing any analysis specific to the individual operating company caps. We were approaching it to try to continue or sustain what's been in place today, which is the numbers that you referenced.
Okay. And going off this just a little bit, so the safety and Katie metrics that are tied to the annual cap increases, those are just the overall Katie and safety standards that are established in First Energy's reliability proceedings.
Yes, those would be the metrics that we would report on annually.
And are these are going to be updated for the new reliability standards in the pending case, or will it be based on the standards that are in place now?
We do have a separate application pending to modify our standards, you're correct. The way this DCR cap provision would work, whatever the applicable Katie and safety standards are that are in effect would be used to administer the cap. So if those Katie and safety standards change at some point over the duration of ESP5, those would be what we measure against for purposes of determining the aggregate rider DCR revenue cap increases.
Okay. And one last question to that end. So those metrics, I'm sorry, never mind. I think you already answered that question.
Okay, thank you.
Back to the NMB, will you be able to walk through the allocation of transmission costs between the different FE companies in Ohio and then between the NMB bucket and the NMB2 bucket? So revenue, how would you break that down between the different companies and customer bases?
I don't have the specific numbers, but I can walk through the process with you if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
So the way that it works is we have total costs that we incur from PJM that sets our overall revenue requirement. The general allocation that we use to allocate those dollars within NMB to our different rate schedules is based on 4 coincident peaks. So we look at each rate schedule for each company and their contribution to the 4 coincident peaks from the prior year. And that's used to allocate the overall bucket of revenue requirement to the individual rate schedules. So the way that this proposal would work is we'd follow that same process. We have the total revenue requirement, we allocate it to the individual rate schedules based on that 4CP allocation. That would set our NMB1 rates, which are the rates that are set up the same way they are today, based on billing demand for the customers that don't have interval metering and charged on energy for residential and lighting customers. From that NMB1 rate, we look at all of the commercial and industrial customers and calculate an overall revenue neutral revenue requirement that's allocated to those commercial and industrial customers, and then divide that by their aggregate NSPLs to come up with the per NSPL rider NMB2 rate. So when you look at the proposed tariff, the rider NMB2 rate is just one rate for all of the customers that it applies to across all 3 companies, designed on a revenue neutral basis off of the aggregate rider NMB1 rate based on that allocation methodology using 4 CPs. Does that help?
Yep, it does.
Yes, sir.
Walk you there in the middle. When you get to the company level, you go ahead and calculate the NMB, revenue neutral amount for each, I think by class you said, is that for NMB one?
So what we do for NMB1, sorry, let me try to explain again. We have our overall revenue requirement. We allocate it by company and by rate schedule based on 4CP, and then divide those allocated revenue requirements by the billing demands or kilowatt hours, whatever the applicable billing units are, and that sets the NMB1 rates. Then what we do from there is look at the commercial and industrial customers only, see what their aggregate allocated revenue requirement is, and on a revenue neutral basis, divide that by those customers' aggregate NSPLs to get the NMB2 rate that would apply to just those customers.
So are you taking out, when you set the NMB one, that's a different pool versus the NMB two? Right?
The NMB1 is based on everybody. Leave everybody in to calculate the rate. Then with NMB2, you carve out the commercial and industrial customers that have advanced or interval meters, get a separate revenue neutral portion of the overall revenue requirement from them, and use that to set the NMB2 rate.
So the UFE would actually be in NMB2 because it would be reflected in the revenue requirement.
It would be part of the total revenue requirement that gets allocated and follows that rate design. So yes, to the extent there's UFE dollars that are in the total revenue requirement, there would be a portion of that that impacts the NMB2 rate.
So you're taking an SSO type of cost, and you're shifting it to shopping customers.
We are, well, today suppliers are responsible for it. So to the extent suppliers are building that into their bid prices, it would be reflected in our SSO rates. Under this proposal, they wouldn't be responsible for that anymore, so in theory, it wouldn't be in the SSO rates, and we'd be recovering it on a non-bypassable basis through the NMB rates.
Okay, so can you took us to how you get NMB2 revenue requirement created. Then you're dividing that by units and doing a per KWH charge as well? Is that how that will be?
Once you get to that part where you're getting the NMB2 revenue requirement, it's one revenue requirement for all the commercial and industrial customers. That's the numerator. Then you look at the aggregate NSPL values for those commercial and industrial customers and divide it to determine the per NSPL rate that would apply under the NMB2 charge.
And at what point in time are the values determined, and do those change? NSPL values?
Those change annually. And we update the rider annually. So under this proposal, we would implement this effective April 1st, 2025. So at that point, when we make that filing for that rider, maybe sometime early in 2025, we would know what the NSPLs were based on peaks from calendar year 2024. And then those would be the NSPLs that are in effect for calendar year 2025 for billing purposes. And that process would continue annually.
April.
The rider would be updated April 1st, yes.
Last translation question.
Sure.
So when you're really creating an NMB1 recovery dollar amount for a C&I class vessel, and you're converting that to an NMB2 rate based on the NSPL.
That's a fair way to look at it, yes. In the aggregate for those customers, yes.
I do just want to clarify, is it a 5CP or is it a 4CP?
The approved allocation for rider NMB that we use today and that we're proposing to continue here is 4CP. So the 4 summer months from the prior year are what we use for allocation purposes. There's schedules in our filing, in our testimony that kind of walk through illustrative work papers for how this would work. So if I'm doing a bad job of explaining, I apologize. Sometimes it's easier to see it there. But it should lay out and show you how the allocation works. But it is 4CP, not 5. Yes, sir.
Different topic, if you may. To the extent you can, in terms of the 20 megawatt on the GLC unit, any discussion on how that 20 megawatts is achieved, or another way of asking would be, how does that relate to the actual typical tranche size?
That's a good question. I'm not sure we had that level of detail in our filing, unless anyone else is in a position. That might be one that
Yeah.
might be better for discovery.
Well, and then the hard part of that is the tranche size then can change as load changes, right?
Yeah.
So that makes that tough.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. Yes, Ms. Board.
New topic. Rider ELR, currently it's offered only for specific customers. Is one of your modifications to open this up to other customers?
No, we would still just make it available to the customers that are on it today.
And if I'm correct, that was, I don't know, a long time ago. Maybe, it was the 2 ESPs ago, I think. So that-
It's changed over the past couple ESPs. It is a specific finite group of customers. There's eligibility criteria in the tariff today that specifies who's eligible for it.
And why can't that those eligibility requirements be updated so it is applied more on a non-discriminatory basis?
So Kim, I think that might be something we can talk about, like as the case goes on, like kind of settlement discussions. Like here, we just want to focus on kind of what we actually proposed.
Yes, sir.
Does the company have a plan for energy efficiency post the 4 years, halfway through the second half of the plan year?
Thank you for that question. I'm sorry if I didn't mention it in my remarks. What we said in our application is that the ESP is 8 years. The energy efficiency plan is proposed to be 4 years. We propose to convene a collaborative of interested parties to meet periodically and talk about it. And that as we are approaching the 4-year mark, we would evaluate in discussions with the collaborative whether it made sense to file with the commission to seek a continuation, extension, modification, or not. So it was sort of like a midpoint check-in that we acknowledged in our application, but we've only specifically proposed a 4-year program with that kind of mid-year or midterm check-in. You're welcome. Yes.
Rider DCR audits. McMillan discusses this in his testimony. He talks about potential refunds. Is this just a normal disallowance for the CE through a regular audit? Is that the potential refunds that are being discussed here?
Sorry, I don't have the testimony in front of me, so I don't have the specific reference. But in general, the Rider DCR audit is looking back at the prior year and determining if any costs were unreasonable based on the facts and circumstances known at the time, I think is the current standard. So we're proposing that process continue as part of ESP 5, that annual audit process.
Okay, so no changes to that type of audit process?
We have not proposed any changes to the audit process, no.
Okay, and then a follow-up, if I may. Does the company currently have language in their Rider DCR tariff to recognize potential refunds, or is that being proposed? Do you know?
I believe we do. If you're referring to language that says the charges are subject to reconciliation and refund,
Okay.
yes, we have that generic
So
language.
all
in
that's
there.
the same, you were just describing the
Yes.
process. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate everybody's time. The questions were great.
10 minutes over.
Wait, can I ask one more question?
Yes, please, despite Kevin's very
I
excellent.
know.
Yes.
So you mentioned the EV and your plan to spend the $12 million, and mostly what I understand is education-related, no investment, no ownership by the utilities. But then you also mentioned incentives, and I don't think you really explained, like, what type of incentive? Are you talking about like a rebate program for residents that, you know, put a charging station in their garage? What incentives are you kind of referring to?
I don't have the details in front of me. I think the general, the financial incentives, not necessarily rebates as much as providing customers almost as a grant or a financial incentive to work with a contractor, someone to better advise them on what they should be doing in terms of converting to electric vehicles. So instead of actually providing the educational materials, you're providing them some financial assistance so they can go out and get more educated on their own.
And Kim, there is a rebate program, just to tag on to that.
Thank you.
Gridmod 2 has the company's rebate proposal.
This is
to
different.
This is different.
This is different, yes. Thanks, Trevor.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, no, that's a great question. Okay, well, Brian, anything else to that?
Nothing further. So
Thank you.
Thanking everybody for your participation, their interest, and we look forward to working with you.